Good morning, guys. Welcome to the final day of Mobile Era. It's great to have you all back with us again. We have an exciting lineup for talks for you today. Without further ado, I'm going to introduce Pearl and Abraham, who are here to talk to you about service workers. Thank you.
What's that?
Do you want the clicker? Hello. How's everybody doing today? This
Hello.
morning.
Good morning. Sorry for the technical difficulties, but I think we're running now. And are we too loud? Too quiet? Just right?
So if I tell terrible jokes, then you'll all be okay with it.
I don't think you can make them agree to that in advance.
By being here, you agree to have me tell you bad jokes.
So we're going to talk to you today about service workers, a powerful, wonderful, and dangerous technology. If you would like to follow along with today's slides, you can do that at slides.today. You can also find the slides there tomorrow or even the day after. Slides.today.
And based on some of the things we're going to show you, they may be stuck on your device forever.
So why should you care about service workers? That's an open question. No, I'm kidding. So service workers enable the core functionality of progressive web apps.
And we've actually, this has been a great year at Mobile Era for progressive web apps. There's lots of great talks, and we'll suggest some of the other ones that you should go to.
Yes.
One of the things that service workers enable is offline experience. So you can have your entire site work offline with no internet. So whether someone's going through a subway tunnel and they lose connection, or there's just a service disruption, service workers can help with that.
And if you don't care about offering an offline experience, service workers can also greatly enhance your performance. Service workers allow you to cache resources on the user's device, which can make network requests much less necessary. And serving from the cache is quite a bit quicker than serving from the network. So even if offline is not on the menu for you, service workers are great for your site's performance.
And push notifications, we're not going to talk a lot about push notifications, but there was a talk yesterday, so check out that video once it's published. I think Robert said it was going to be published in 5 or 10 minutes after this talk, so.
So right, so you should check right now and then complain to him if it's not available yet. But yes, again, so push notifications, for better or for worse, rely on service workers. So that's the brief overview of why you should care about service workers. What are service workers?
Well, Pearl, I'm glad you asked. So they're basically a JavaScript web worker that runs in a separate process on your client's device. And it has some limitations. One of those, the really big ones, is there's no DOM access, so you can't query select and modify the UI that your users see.
Service workers have another limitation, which is that they require a secure origin. So it's HTTPS only. Service workers aren't going to work on an insecure origin, which is a good thing because service workers are pretty powerful, and we want to make sure that they're in a secure context.
They basically work as a kind of on-device network proxy. So anytime fetch requests happen in your website, on your HTML, whether it's loading, and it's not just JavaScript fetch requests, it's also image requests, font requests, other documents.
Your CSS files, anything.
They will all essentially get proxied through your service worker, so your service worker can do custom things. That's how the offline works, is your service worker can catch it and do other stuff with it.
Here's our very rough schematic of how this works. So the service worker mediates between your page and the network and the cache. So your requests, whether it's fetch requests or links in your HTML, go through the service worker. The service worker, depending on how you want it to act, can decide if it should respond from the cache or from the network or from some combination of the cache and the network, and return the response to those requests back to your page.
So this is kind of the ideal image, and we're going to walk you through a little bit of how we get to this point. one of the kind of intentional designs of service workers is that they are async in nature. And this is actually both in how code executes in them as well as how a service worker gets bootstrapped on a client device. But that also does mean there's some limitations about accessing standard web APIs like local storage. There are asynchronous proposals coming down the line that might enable some of these in the future.
Also, if you're interested in joining an in-sync cover band called Async, that's something that we're, come talk to us afterwards.
Something we're
have lots of
workshopping it. We're thinking that might be our proposal for next year.
Yes, a musical presentation. So generally, and there are exceptions, but generally you have one active service worker per site. So if you've got your site open in multiple tabs or in multiple windows, they're all going to be interacting with one service worker generally.
That's generally how you'll want to orchestrate your site, but you can have multiple progressive web apps, multiple service workers, multiple manifests for your single domain. If you want to see an example, we have a quick example you can look at.
So the default scope for your service worker is just the root of your site, but you can create additional service workers in different scopes. Oh, and this is what I already said. So normally your service worker, a single service worker is controlling all the instances of your site that are active at any given time.
Yeah. Yep.
Yep.
So one of the positive and negatives of service workers is they're persistent. So this means that once you have a service worker installed on your device, if you close your browser, shut down your computer, restart, and open the browser again, you will still have those service workers installed, and they can still be active.
And again, this is a great thing. It allows your site to load almost instantaneously on subsequent visits. But when things go wrong with your service worker, this can be a problem. And we'll talk about some of the things that can go wrong and some of the potential fixes.
Some of the fishy aspects of service workers.
But before we get into where things go wrong, we want to talk just a little bit about how service workers, about the service worker life cycle and how service workers do what they do, how they work.
How do they even?
How do they even?
Maybe they don't even. Maybe they odd.
So let's start at the beginning. I'm ignoring that. So a user goes to a site. That's the beginning.
No, the beginning is 13 billion years ago when...
In this case, we're going to start at a different beginning. A user goes to a site, navigates to a site. Normally, what happens is the site sends a request to the network, a request for some HTML, some CSS, maybe some JavaScript. Those requests go to the network, and the network responds. But if you want to add a service worker to the mix, the first step is in your application code to register your service worker.
And that's pretty easy to do. You basically just say, hey, I have this service worker. It's this JavaScript file. It's over here. Go register it and install it as a service worker. One of the tips that you can do is this happens on your main page as it's loading, and so you don't want to slow down that first experience for your user. So you probably want to delay the registration of your service worker until that current and immediate experience for your user is done.
So when the registration happens, the browser will start to download your service worker and install it, which we'll talk about in a second, and then it might start downloading resources that you want to pre-cache. So you really want to, as Abraham says, you really want to not kick that off immediately. You want to wait until your page is fully loaded.
And in the back end, you essentially have this. You have your page that the user is currently viewing, and your service worker is disconnected in the background on the device getting kicked off.
So it's registered and it's just there, but it's not doing anything yet. Because after registration, when your registration successfully completes, that will kick off the install phase, and your service worker will get installed on your site.
So in the install phase, this is when people generally will pre-cache critical assets for your site. for their site. A lot of
Not
times,
maybe for your site.
maybe for your
That
site.
might, I don't know if that would be on purpose or not.
I was going to say something, but
Okay, so this is where you're gonna
it went away.
you're gonna pre-cache assets. So for instance, if it's a single page application and you've got an app shell pattern, this is where you would cache your shell. If you're not a single page app, you might want to, your basic CSS, maybe your header HTML, all the things, you can think of it on mobile as sort of your basic app install, the resources that make your app available. And your dynamic data can come later, but this is the assets that create the sort of framework for your app. So you're doing that.
So you'll go out to the network, get all those resources, that HTML, CSS, JavaScript, fonts. Maybe you should avoid the fonts, but
That's a different topic altogether. So the service worker grabs grabs the assets that you tell it to grab from the network, and then tucks those assets into the cache, and then they're there for the future.
cool. All right, we're done. So thanks everybody for coming. No,
For the indefinite future.
yeah. The cache doesn't auto expire things, so anything you put in there, you should be aware of and know how to clean up if you need to in the future.
Yes.
Which actually, we have another slide later we'll talk about.
Yes, we will talk about that. So Workbox is a great tool from Google that will generate service workers for you and help you manage that pre-caching. It can do a lot of things on its own, or you can have fine-grained control if you like. It's pretty flexible, but you can basically tell Workbox what types of files you want to pre-cache, and it will just take care of telling the service worker which exact files to pre-cache. It will version your cache name so that it becomes easy to delete it in the future if you need to. So we would certainly recommend that to use Workbox for this instead of rolling your own.
And lucky for you, later today there is an entire talk on Workbox.
So yes, we're not going to talk in great detail about Workbox or how the specific
Or
implementation
how it works.
or how Workbox works, but we would recommend this talk this afternoon.
The page the service worker has completed its installation phase. It has pre-cached a bunch of stuff. It's essentially waiting in the background now. It doesn't usually do anything immediately, partially because of backwards compatibility. That page that the user is already doing stuff on might not be set up properly to handle being controlled by a service worker. So right now it doesn't do anything.
So the next phase before the service worker can take control of your page and can start intercepting requests, it needs to become activated and then get control of the page. So the activation, so we should talk a little bit about when that happens.
We told you a few minutes ago we were going to talk about cache cleanup, and this is a place where you can do that. A service worker will not switch from waiting into the activation stage until all previous service workers are terminated. And that's so that you don't have a weird thing of multiple service workers, what pages interact with what service workers when. That's a whole different ball of yarn. So you wait until the old service worker is gone. If you have an old service worker, you start activating the new one. Since this is now going to be the only service worker, it's okay for that service worker to clean up old caches, old data that you don't need anymore.
So to terminate, in order to allow for the termination of the old service worker, generally you need to close all your instances of your site. If you've got it open on multiple tabs, you need to close all those tabs. It's not going to generally reach out and grab control over existing pages.
We could have used the cat GIF here again.
Yes, yes. So once the previous service worker, if there was one, has been terminated, and a new service worker has been activated, it still needs to claim control of your pages. And it can do that in a few different ways. It can do that on a page refresh, or on any sort of navigation request, or you can programmatically grab control of the page by using client's claim in your service worker code. But it doesn't happen automatically. Something needs to happen to give the service worker, the active service worker, control over your pages.
But then once that happens, you basically have this diagram where you have a bunch of pages open. Those are claimed by a service worker, and any network requests they create will get proxied through that service worker.
And happy path, and everything is working well.
Nothing would ever go wrong with this.
No. So as I think we've indicated, the life cycle of the service worker is a little complicated, and in development, these various delays between install and activation and taking control of the page can be a little tricky. So the Chrome Dev Tools have a very helpful checkbox that you should check during development that will allow your service worker, when you make changes to your service worker, will allow those to happen immediately instead of having to wait through this whole cycle.
Apparently, we just had to wait for our slides toolbar to disappear.
Yes.
And it's gone.
And it's gone.
Magic.
Yay. Okay, so now your service worker has been installed, has been activated, has control of your pages, and then at that point it enters the idle phase. It relaxes. It's hanging out. It's there, ready and waiting to do stuff when there's stuff for it to do. So things like a fetch request, for example.
So you could imagine that, probably a user is going around different pages on your site and they want to view, maybe your site is, my favorite go-to is Instagram for cookies. I always like the idea of many photos of different cookies. And not the digital cookies that we usually deal with, but
the edible
the Nami chocolate chip cookies.
So when your idle service worker is there, there's a fetch request
For a cookie image.
For a cookie image that will go to the service worker.
Normally, the most efficient and quick thing to do is to check your cache to see if you already have that image on the device.
If that request has already been cached, that's great. Your service worker can just grab the response from the cache and give it back to your application. And that's very, very quick. It's from a user point of view, it's almost instantaneous, much quicker than having to go all the way to the network to go get the cookie image once again.
We can't guarantee that something's going to be cached on the device, so you pretty much always have to have a network fallback if you are doing that approach. This is much more expensive. This is on the order of hundreds or thousands of milliseconds versus maybe tens of milliseconds. But this will essentially fall back to the standard behavior that websites have.
So your service worker will forward the request to the network. It will find the cookie image that you need. It'll grab it, and it will tuck it nicely into your cache for future use, so that when you want the same cookie image again later, it's there, ready and waiting for you.
And then since it as well as storing a version in the cache, it will also return a version back to the page.
Like this. Like that, back to the page.
And that's essentially how a single request will work from the page to the service worker and back.
Now, you might not want things to work quite in this way. So for instance, if it's really important for your use case to have the very most up-to-date devices, or not devices, that too, but the most up-to-date resources, then you might not want to go to the cache first. You might want to go to the network first and only go to the cache if the network isn't available. Or there are other caching strategies that you can use.
One of my favorite is the cache first and update, and basically that'll find whatever's in the cache, send that to the client, and at the same time it'll actually go do a network request in the background to check to see if there's an update to that resource, and if there is, it'll update the cache and notify the client saying, hey, there's an update to this resource, you could reload or re-request it.
You can have your little toast pop up and tell your user to update. So Workbox comes kind of pre-packaged with a bunch of different caching strategies set up for you, so it's very easy to select the caching strategy that's most appropriate for your use case, and Workbox will handle it for you.
I don't know. I always thought that the web was immutable and people deployed their site once and that was it. But I've been informed that you actually have to update and deploy new things. So we should talk about how service workers get updated.
Yes, so it might happen that the pages that you have that are in your pre-cache change. Maybe you've got a new logo, or maybe you want your service worker to do some things that it hasn't done in the past. And so you will need to, when you update your site, update your service worker. And so we'll talk about how that happens. But first, we will tell you that you shouldn't roll your so in most cases you're going to make updating your service worker a part of your build process. If you're using Webpack, how many of you use Webpack?
Quite a few.
So a lot of people use Webpack. There's a really great Workbox plugin for Webpack that you can use that makes updating your service worker and the service worker cache easy. Workbox will automatically create a new cache, give it and version it, so that it will just update what has changed.
Are the rest of you using Rollup or something similar? Who's using Rollup?
Gulp? Grunt?
How many of you are using a tool like Angular or Create React App and have just no idea what it's doing under the covers?
No, you don't make people.
Yeah. I mean, most of those are, a lot of those are using Webpack. But,
yeah.
So next, I think we covered everything on that one.
Okay, so you deploy your new service worker and your new assets that are going to be pre-cached. So it goes out into the world, but your new service worker will not take effect immediately. As we talked about, there's these steps that need to happen. So if there is a navigation request, your browser is going to look and see if there's a new service worker and download it. And oops, I think there's a slide about that coming up. So on navigation, or if there's no navigation event, then the browser is going to check if a service worker has been in place for 24 hours, and
and it happens on activity. So if a user is active every hour, then your browser may not check until they're active after 24 hours since the last update. So generally, users will probably get a new service worker within 24 hours if they're active on your site, but it could be a little while.
So your browser does regularly check. So when it checks for a new service worker, it'll download the service worker and do a byte comparison and see if it's new, if anything has changed between the currently installed service worker and the new service worker that it has downloaded.
And then it'll basically take that new service worker that it downloaded and start doing that entire install process we talked about, and it'll do it to the side without touching the existing service worker.
So yeah, your old service worker is still active, still has control of the pages while the install is happening. Then again, as we talked about at the activation stage, it's not until the old service worker terminates that the new service worker will come and take control of the page.
Mm-hmm. Unless there are some programmatic ways where you can immediately take over, but there are risks to that, so that's not the default.
Yes.
And basically, you have a new service worker that's now managing your open pages.
So that's the happy path. That's how updating a service worker should happen and does most of the time.
Yeah. But
not
break.
all of the time.
Things break.
Things do break, and we want to tell you a couple stories about recent real-world breakages and what happened and what the fixes are, and in some cases what you can do to avoid the problem from happening in the first place.
I'm sure everybody here writes tests for all their application code, right? So a couple of nods. I like that. That's good. So you might have seen the recent launch of testingjavascript.com.
Have you seen? Has anybody looked at this site? It's a new. It's a
Yeah.
yeah, a couple. It's
It's all the organizers, though. I don't know if.
and fellow GDEs, right? Yeah. So it's a really. If you haven't looked at it, I would recommend it. It's a interesting. It's a for-pay sort of course on testing JavaScript. But it was a fairly high-profile release that happened here recently. Lots of activity on Twitter about the release happening, a lot of countdown, and so the site released, and it's great. And I went to it, and it loaded beautifully, and everything was wonderful.
But
Until
you then go back a few minutes later to look at the site again, and you got something like this.
This is what you see. So on initial load, everything was fine.
This is kind of like seeing the Matrix
Yes.
for web developers.
But then on subsequent visits, this is what you see in the browser. So
And-
not good.
No, this is not great.
So what happened? Why was the subsequent visit so messed up?
So this is kind of an interesting bug. Basically, once the service worker was going through the install phase, it was pre-caching all of the assets, including the HTML. When it went off and said, "Hey, give me index HTML. I want this so I can cache it," the server said, "Actually, that's not here anymore. That's over here at /." And this is a pretty common server configuration because you don't want the same content on multiple different URLs on your site. So this is pretty common. The problem, though, is that they had a bug in their service worker implementation so that once the redirect got back to the service worker and it was cached, the fact that it was HTML was lost, and it cached it as just plain text.
So the service worker receives the response in plain text. So the browser had received the original response fine, but then the service worker receives it in plain text and caches the plain text response in its cache. So then on subsequent visits, when the request is cached and the service worker responds from the cache instead of the network.
We have a slide for that.
Oh, okay. There we go. Then this happens.
So the subsequent visit, you say, "Hey, I want to render this page." The server is like, "Oh, I have that request in my cache. Here, have it." Except that it's text and not HTML. And so then users got this, and that's not great.
Yes. So so this is.
I haven't actually read this. I'm kind of curious.
Do you want to read it out loud to everybody? No, don't do it.
Angle bracket, bang, doc type, HTML. No.
So not a great situation to be in, especially for a high-profile release of a
Yeah,
new site.
your launch of your brand new site is a big moment, and so having a bunch of your users have issues like this is not great.
Luckily, it was a site that was very much designed for tech-savvy people, and it was also the people who had gone to it were sort of early adopters who had heard about it on Twitter. So that made the fix fairly straightforward.
They're reading about it on Twitter because Google Plus is getting shut down.
Yeah, right. So there are a couple different ways that you could fix a problem like this. The first option, and the one that was used in this case, was to delete the service worker and to tell users over Twitter to clear out their cache or to access the site on a different browser.
You could also go buy a new computer if you wanted. That's an
Right.
option.
And they would, if they use a different browser, they would have to access it through that new browser forever and ever and ever.
Actually, if we tell people that their service worker is caching spiders, then they probably would go buy a new computer.
That's a good idea. That's what we'll do for all problems.
And this can work, but anybody who doesn't figure out that they need to clear their data, they will just be stuck on that plain text essentially forever.
Yes. So it's a solution that was fine in this case, but not a great solution. Yeah. That's a good question. But
It will not update after 24 hours because they have an installed service worker that is running just fine. In 24 hours, they say, let's check if there's a new service worker. They would go fetch it. The service worker doesn't exist anymore, so they would never have a new service worker to install. So it would be stuck on that existing running one.
So a better solution, a more kind of cleaner solution would be to deploy a new service worker instead of just deleting the service worker altogether. To deploy a new service worker that clears the cache, and that in that case, it would after 24 hours clear out the cache.
And so that new service worker that's deployed basically is a no-op. It doesn't do anything. So anytime that page goes to load and say fetch this resource, the service is like, I don't care, I'm not going to do anything, and it would just hit the network instead of the broken cache.
So this is what that service worker might look like. It would not do any more caching, but it would look to see if there are any existing caches, iterate over those, and get rid of them all. So that would be a more. It could take a while. It could take up to 24 hours, but it would eventually solve the problem in a way that just deleting the service worker doesn't.
I think the other option is just, well, you probably can't do this with GDPR, but you could just keep a record of everybody that visits your site, where they live, and send someone to go reset their browser cache.
That sounds like a great paper mill. Yeah, that's a great idea. I don't know who's going to pay for the stamps, but so that was a pretty interesting and pretty high-profile example that just happened. This was just what last week. So there's another a similar but also kind of more subtle problem that happened with a site for Ohio DevFest, which is a conference in Ohio in the U.S. Abraham is listed as one of the amazing speakers at that conference. So this was a much harder to observe problem, at least for most users.
Yeah, and so they had a conference in 2017, and everything was fine. Their users got the content they wanted. 2018 came around. They deployed a new version of the site, and some of their users were seeing old static content, like they were seeing DevFest 2017, the old venue, but they were seeing current speakers and current schedule. And that's because speakers and schedules were coming from the database. That was not pre-cache, that was runtime that would happen dynamically. So, and the fact that only some people were seeing it. If you had visited the site in 2017, gotten the old page, then you would see this mismatch of content.
So this happened because we had visited the site in 2017. We both had this experience, but certainly not everybody did. And it was a weird experience. It's clearly the wrong year, but also the new information. So a weird mixed bag. So what happened? So in 2017, as we've already touched on, everything was fine. There were assets that were pre-cached, and there was no problem.
Then in 2018, they deployed the new version of the site. The service worker downloaded, the browser saw there was an updated, downloaded the new service worker. The service worker said, hey, cache these files, and these files. But some of those files failed to pre-cache.
And so if the pre-cache does not complete, the install does not complete successfully, and the new service worker is never installed, and therefore the cache never gets updated, and the site continues to serve the old assets.
And you can see it was visible in the developer tools by the service worker implementation requesting the same file over and 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 over again.
So
until the browser was like, okay, you've requested this file 20 times. That's it. I'm cutting you off. And then the install step blew up because the browser said no.
Yes. So in this case, this was a problem caused by a redirect. So a side lesson is beware redirects. So caused by redirect, but you could run into the same kind of problem if you're trying to pre-cache an asset that just doesn't, for whatever reason, doesn't exist on your site.
If you do a new build of your site and deploy new assets, but forget to deploy the new version of your service worker, it might be pointing at the old assets that don't exist anymore.
So, so to fix this problem, now if it was just that an asset was that it was requesting was missing, then the solution would be to push that asset so that that asset becomes available. The pre-cache can finish, and then the install can finish, and everything will update appropriately.
I mean, the easy fix is just to remove that redirect or replace the missing files if that's the particular problem in this case.
Another potential solution in this case would be to update the service worker implementation so that it correctly handles redirect. That was the specific problem in this case. And the site was using an older version of a tool called SW Precache that was not handling redirects correctly. So I think a takeaway from this is to make sure that you're using the most up-to-date tools and the newest version. So use Workbox, keep your Workbox up to date.
Service workers are still a very new technology, and the way that browsers handle them are changing subtly from month to month as people identify issues like this. So these tools will get updated to make sure they handle those use cases correctly and keep up to date.
So those are two kind of recent stories that we found pretty interesting, and we want to talk about a couple other talk more quickly about a couple other things that can go wrong, a gotcha or two that we have run into. One that Abraham ran into fairly recently with his personal site.
She's always throwing me under the bus.
Yeah,
I was like, no, I don't want to use this example. She's like, no, you have to use no.
Well, you're good about keeping your about actually updating your personal site, which I do not do. So.
So I use Workbox on my personal site, and at one point I just copied some snippets, and I was using a custom name for the service worker file, and so that was part of the configuration, and I was like, oh, I should just remove that configuration and use the default. So I did that, deployed a new version, and it broke. And the reason, it's kind of a chicken and the egg problem where the HTML cached on my device said the service worker is over here. I'm going to check to see if there's an update. Oh, that file doesn't exist anymore, so we're going to fall back and use the existing service worker. Whereas the deploy that I never got that was on the server said, oh, the service worker's over here. But because I was stuck on that old version, I never got the update. So the way to fix this is kind of like what we talked about earlier, where you keep two service workers, basically. The old service worker won't serve that broken cache, and then you get the live content from the server and installs the new service worker from over here. I think this, oh yeah, so this is, I think I was going to put a slide in for this, but basically, if you ever have a service worker at a URL, you must forever serve a service worker at that URL. It doesn't have to do anything, but it has to be there.
Dun, 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 dun.
Dun, 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 dun.
Yeah, service workers, be careful. Be careful. So one other gotcha that we want to cover is a case when your service worker just doesn't update as you would expect because the service worker file has been cached. Not in the service worker cache, but in the standard HTTP cache. So this is not going to happen in Chrome anymore. Chrome has made a change a couple versions ago that so that it is not caching service worker files, so that you won't run into this problem. But it's a problem that you could still run into in other places. So that's something to be aware of.
I think all the browsers will update to have the same behavior, but you might also have a proxy, a corporate proxy on your network or something, So if you have cache control headers on your service worker, you might be getting old service workers longer than you expect. So the fix for this is just say, hey, this is service worker, don't cache this no matter what.
Yes.
That's pretty easy.
Keep your service worker out of the cache so that you can keep your cached assets up to date in the service worker.
What's
Anyway.
I think my favorite programming joke is the two hardest things in programming is naming things, cache invalidation, and off by one errors.
All right, moving along. So I think the takeaway, and certainly what we have learned, is that service workers are incredibly powerful, really useful tools, but they're also difficult. They're complicated, and they're not. And there are a lot of ways that things can go wrong.
And that classic problem of it works on my computer is even harder on service workers because you don't just have to worry about the current version of your site. You also have to worry about the version of the site you deployed a month ago that your user still has on their computer.
So, like people, service workers are difficult, and you should.
What are you looking at me for?
And you should respect their power and treat them with some care and know them well. Treat your service worker as you yourself would like to be treated.
And it's Halloween, so we threw some Halloween emojis in.
And then there's a pun about treating, right?
Oh yes.
Right, that was that was your idea. All right. We're from Bendy Works in Madison, Wisconsin, and they pay for us to go to conferences, so we are obliged to show their slide.
We also enjoy showing their side, and if you are ever in Wisconsin and want some deep fried cheese curds, let us know.
Yeah, we would love to take you out for deep fried cheese curds. You can, at slides.today, you can find the slides for today's presentation as well as some resources about service workers and related topics.
Thanks for coming.
Thanks.